There is a moment that Jean Tierney described only once in public. She was at a USO event during the Second World War. A young Marine approached her. She was the most famous actress in Hollywood at that moment. Her face had just been on the cover of every major magazine in America. She had been called, by the studio that owned her image, the most beautiful woman on the screen. The Marine shook her hand. He told her he had broken quarantine to meet her. He had rubella. He knew he had rubella. He shook her hand anyway. Jean Tierney smiled and thanked him for his service. Several weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. Her daughter Daria was born deaf, partially blind, severely mentally disabled. She would require institutional care for the rest of her life. Jean Tierney spent the next 20 years inside a breakdown so total that the studio system that had built her simply waited for it to finish and then moved on. The Marine who shook her hand was never identified. He never came forward. He never knew what he had done. Or perhaps he did know and decided that was a weight he could not carry. Jean Tierney carried it for both of them. For the rest of her life. Jean Eliza Tierney was born on November 19, 1920, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father, Howard, was an insurance broker with social ambitions and a gift for living beyond his means. Her mother, Belle, was a former schoolteacher who had married up and intended to stay there. They were the kind of family that moved in circles slightly above their actual financial position and worked constantly to maintain the appearance. Jean was their second child. She was beautiful in the way that stopped conversations. Dark hair, green eyes, a bone structure so precise that photographers who worked with her in later years described it as impossible. Howard Tierney recognized what his daughter looked like and immediately understood the financial implications. He moved the family to Europe in 1937 so that Jean could be finished in Switzerland. She was 17 years old. He was building an asset. When Jean Tierney returned from Europe, she was 18 years old and had been noticed by enough people in enough important rooms that the path to Hollywood was already being cleared. Her father took control of her career immediately. He formed a company, Beltier Corporation, named for himself and his wife. The company signed Jean Tierney as its primary client. Howard Tierney negotiated her contracts. Howard Tierney collected her fees. Howard Tierney made every major decision about her professional life until she was 20 years old and had enough standing to begin pushing back. She pushed back by falling in love with a man her father despised. His name was Oleg Cassini. He was a fashion designer, Italian-born, charming, handsome in a European way that Howard Tierney found threatening. He was also broke. Howard Tierney refused to give his blessing. Jean Tierney married Cassini anyway in June 1941. She was 20 years old. She had spent her entire life having decisions made for her. This one she made herself. 20th Century Fox signed Jean Tierney in 1940. The studio's plan for her was standard. Beautiful woman, exotic quality, dark and luminous in a way that the camera translated into something close to otherworldly. They put her in westerns first, then in dramas, then in Laura. Laura was released in 1944. It is considered one of the finest films ever made. A detective investigating the murder of a beautiful woman falls in love with her portrait before he discovers she is not dead. Jean Tierney played Laura. She appears for most of the film as a painting, as an image, as a face that men project their desires onto without knowing anything about the person behind it. The irony was not discussed at the time. It is difficult to miss now. Jean Tierney's entire Hollywood career was a version of what Laura describes. A woman who exists primarily as an image for other people to consume. The film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. Jean Tierney was not nominated. The studio considered her face the instrument of the film's success. Not her performance, her face. In the summer of 1943, Jean Tierney was pregnant and performing at a USO event. The Marine who had broken quarantine to meet her shook her hand. In January 1944, her daughter Daria was born. The doctors told Jean Tierney immediately that something was wrong. The baby was not developing normally. Tests over the following months confirmed the cause: congenital rubella syndrome. The rubella virus, contracted during the first trimester, had damaged the developing brain and sensory systems in ways that could not be repaired. Daria Cassini would be deaf, partially blind, severely cognitively impaired. She would require full-time care indefinitely. Jean Tierney sat with this information alone. She told almost nobody. She went back to work, because going back to work was what 20th Century Fox required. And because Jean Tierney had been trained since she was 17 years old to keep the performance going regardless of what was happening behind it. For several years, she managed. She made Dragonwyck. She made The Razor's Edge. She made The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. She made Leave Her to Heaven, for which she received her only Academy Award nomination. She played a woman so consumed by jealousy and possession that she allows a child to drown rather than compete for her husband's attention. She played a woman who destroys everything around her in order to maintain control of the one thing she loves. The Academy nominated her for Best Actress. She did not win. She went home to a daughter who did not recognize her voice. Her marriage to Oleg Cassini ended in 1952. The pressure of Daria's care had done what the studio system and her father's interference and the war years had not quite managed. It had broken the marriage apart. Jean Tierney placed Daria in a permanent care facility. It was the decision that the doctors recommended. It was the decision that allowed Jean Tierney to continue working. It was also the decision she never forgave herself for. She visited regularly. Daria did not know who she was. The breakdown began quietly in 1952 and became total by 1955. The specific trigger was a love affair. She had fallen in love with Ali Khan, the Playboy prince who had previously been married to Rita Hayworth. The relationship was intense and brief, and ended when Ali Khan's family made clear that marriage to a divorced American actress was not possible. Jean Tierney returned to Hollywood. She could not sleep. She could not eat. She could not remember her lines. She sat in her dressing room at 20th Century Fox and could not make herself leave it. The studio sent a doctor. The doctor reported that she was experiencing a mental breakdown. The studio suspended her contract. She was 34 years old. She was admitted to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. Over the next several years, she received electroconvulsive therapy. 32 sessions. She described the experience in her memoir as walking into a room and walking out a different person. Not better, different. The memories that electroconvulsive therapy erased in 1955 did not come back. She lost years of her life to a treatment that the medicine of the period considered appropriate. 20th Century Fox did not wait for her. The studio that had built her image, that had put her face on the poster for Laura and called her the most beautiful woman on the screen, had no mechanism for managing a star who could not perform. Her contract was not renewed. She was released. Like Judy Garland before her. Like every star before her who had broken under the weight of what the system required. The system had no use for broken things. She came back. That is the part of Jean Tierney's story that gets lost in the tragedy. She came back. She made advise and consent in 1962. She was 41 years old. She had survived electroconvulsive therapy and the dissolution of her marriage and the guilt of a daughter she could not help and the loss of a career she had built from nothing. She met a Texas oil man named W. Howard Lee. He was patient with her in the way that the studio system had never been. He did not require performance. He did not require her face to mean anything other than what it meant to him. They married in 1960. She described the marriage as the first time she had been loved for herself rather than for what she represented. She spent the last 30 years of her life in Texas, away from Hollywood, away from the system that had built her and broken her, away from the photographers and the fan mail and the studio doctors and the executives who had discussed her body and her breakdown and her contract in rooms she was not invited into. Daria Cassini lived in institutional care until her death in 2010. She was 66 years old. Jean Tierney died in 1991. She never stopped visiting Daria. Daria never knew who she was. The cruel irony at the end of Jean Tierney's story is not the Marine with rubella. Though that is cruel enough. The cruel irony is this. The studio system that required Jean Tierney to perform through a breakdown, that suspended her contract when she could not, that released her when she became inconvenient, produced nothing that lasted. The films survived. The studio did not care about the films. The studio cared about the contracts and the fees and the magazine covers and the fan mail. All of it is gone. The films are still being watched. Laura is still considered one of the greatest films ever made. Jean Tierney's face is still on the poster. The system that owned that face gave her nothing in return. Not protection, not support, not acknowledgement of what they had taken. Just a suspension notice and a released contract and the assumption that the next beautiful face would be along shortly. She deserved better than that. The Marine who broke quarantine was never identified. The studio that suspended her when she broke was never held accountable. Daria never knew her mother's name. Jean Tierney knew all three of these things every day for the rest of her life. Did you know Jean Tierney's story before today? Tell me in the comments what should have been different.